in that sense. Okay, I got it. It would seem to me that, and that view is, so if a man's wife and children died in a car accident, you may not write he was distraught and grief-stricken unless you have some letter where he said it. We've got to have documentation for everything. The other view is that biography is an art form, that it is portraiture, and you are really creating a portrait of this individual based on as many facts and documentation as you can put together. But it is necessarily then going to be your view, you, the writer, as much as a painting of a person is going to be that painter's view of the person. So necessarily, not everyone is going to find this this view corresponding to their view of it. And that'll sort of come up when I talk about responses to the book. So I have a feeling these topics are kind of going to mesh together in a way. So I should also say this book was not my idea at all. A friend of mine, Bly Randolph, who lives in Atlanta, was working on this book. And she asked me if I wanted to come aboard with it after I had just finished writing about John Hughes. And I remember thinking, well, that would be, I don't know a lot about Dorothy Day, but this will be interesting because they are the poles of American Catholic experience. Archbishop John Hughes was a very aggressive man. He was of a very pugilistic sort. He, of course, in the time in which he was the Archbishop of the diocese, which was constantly in a state of great distress, that was the era of convent burnings, church burnings, an enormous nativist Protestant prejudice against Catholics. And his view was not remotely Christ-like, let's put it that way. Turning the other cheek was no part of John Hughes's character whatsoever. He believed if you're hit, I mean, there's something terribly Trump-like about him in a way. If you're hit, you should hit back even harder. And so whenever Catholic churches were under attack, or whenever Catholicism or the Irish were under attack, he was a very fierce spirit in the press and in the pulpit. And then there's Dorothy Day. If I talk about the poles of American Catholic experience, I mean, John Hughes would have no use for pacifists. I don't think he had terribly much use for women either. He was a very institution-minded man. And so here we have this person who is not very institution-minded. And I would say probably the most radical pacifist in American history, certainly the most radical pacifist I have ever heard about, because we're not just talking about someone who opposed World War I or our involvement in Korea or Vietnam. We're talking about someone who opposed our going to war during World War II. And we're also talking about America's most ardent advocate for the homeless, which was not quite a priority for Archbishop Hughes, and I don't think a priority today in this society in many ways. And so I decided that this would be an interesting project. The more I learned about her, of course, she has left so many of her papers to the archives in Milwaukee at Marquette University. So that was a great source for Bly Randolph and I to delve into with this. So she also destroyed a fair number of papers I discovered along the way, which is, from a biographer's point of view, heartbreaking. Those were undoubtedly interesting. The letters I'd really want to see about her early life and different conflicts along the way. But everyone has a right to try to shield his or her own privacy. But there was plenty of material, to work with this book. But the reason I really wanted to write it, though, was she was an almost impossible person, unlike my other subjects, I felt, to get a handle on in some ways. There are more paradoxes involved with this woman. There are more paradoxes involved with this woman than I think almost any of us have ever known. On the one hand, she could be seen as this very progressive spirit, of course, and many liberals and progressives then would look to Dorothy Day and say that her views are stellar, and she's a model for what we should be feeling about those who are less fortunate. And on the other hand, then, we have a woman who became not merely a Catholic, not merely converted, who found her way to God from a very irreligious conservative family, but you have a person who became a very Orthodox Catholic. And this is distressing to people, to secular people of a liberal or progressive bent. How is it possible? What do we make of a woman then who believes in voluntary poverty and believes in the New Testament and the Sermon on the Mount in a more literal way than almost anybody that we would ever meet? And then on the other extreme is also allied herself with what many on the left would see as a very reactionary institution. And I just love the fact, the more I came to understand her, that this was a woman who could please nobody. This was a woman who irritated the hell out of people on the left for her insistence that we must never speak against the papacy, that we must follow the church teachings about sex in every way, not only about abortion, but about masturbation, about homosexuality, et cetera, et cetera. And then the people on the other end of the political spectrum would look at her and say how wonderful that she was a devout, if too opinionated woman who had come to the church. And yet, isn't it appalling that she is so militantly against capitalism? She is so critical of America in so many ways that she refuses to speak ill of communism, which of course, to those on the right then was another horrifying aspect of her. And it was try to come to terms then with this woman who was inexplicable to those who didn't share her views. But then how many people would share the views of this woman whose views were often seen to be in this culture polar opposites in some way? And to me, this had great meaning because years ago, I had lost my faith a very long time ago. And just to be autobiographical for a moment, in part, it's Dorothy Day who brought me back to the church, which leads a certain number of my liberal secular friends in New York to say, how could you possibly align yourself with a church that has so many reactionary views? And it led me to have to clarify what it actually means to be a person of faith. And I thank Dorothy Day for this in many ways. I don't, in some ways, I'm digressing here a bit, but a lot of this had to do with Donald Trump, if I'm going to be honest. Okay, this book is being thought about during the time when Donald Trump is president. And I happen to be reading St. Augustine at the time. That helps too. I think of my coming back to the church being a matter of Donald Trump, St. Augustine, and Dorothy Day. And my feelings during the beginning of the Trump era were one of such complete horror that led me to the sense of, is more than I'd ever felt, and especially in all my decades of agnosticism blending into atheism after a very devout Catholic youth. I came to feel that if this can't be it, this cannot be it, that we live and die in this world like this man who was our leader, and all that matters is our comfort and our security and our ego, and that this absolutely positively cannot be it. And this was where my connection to Dorothy Day as a subject to write about and a person to think more about really took off, because I think the largest fact of Dorothy Day is that her whole mission in life involved many different dimensions, and we must care for the poor and the needy, and we must believe in God, and we must believe that there is something beyond us somehow, however beyond our understanding. This is where St. Augustine also comes in so nicely, the idea that we can't know in any definitive way much about God, but we can feel the presence, what the Shekinah, as those of Jewish faith would say, we can feel the presence, and that her whole mission was to suggest that our ego, and especially the American ego, was the problem, was an enormous problem in keeping us from both a belief in something larger than ourselves and a real understanding of what it means to be fully human. And throughout the book, I kept trying to put myself more and more into her place as someone who was willing to live a life in which the diminishment of the ego was absolutely central. And to read in her early writings from the 1920s, where she talks about her fear that Americans say they're religious people. We all know those surveys, right? Where everybody's, 90% of all Americans say they are religious people. Okay. And yet her concern that actually the God that Americans worshiped was comfort, security, affluence, technology, innovation, all of this was so far ahead of its time to me, writings from the 20s and 30s about what we actually worshiped. And she included many priests and bishops in this questioning. So that's where I realized I'm not writing about a plaster saint. I'm not writing about a progressive. would have no interest in writing a book about someone who was 100% lined up with my views as a liberal Democrat who believes this, and this. And I wanted to write about somebody monstrously confusing, but who understood where we had gone astray. And this to me is what I felt the book should be all about. There was some criticism about the subtitle, Dissenting Voice of the American Century. Was that emphasizing her politics too much? Was that placing her in an American history context too much? And you could say that because, yes, the book is not merely a spiritual account of this woman at all. It definitely is very involved with her politics. But I also felt we as a society in the American century now passing from us, that we were a very good model of how wrong things could go if our sense of what mattered in life was our security, our comfort, our affluence. And I do believe she was 100% right, that we've made a God. Our God is technology. Our God is innovation. Our God is this is what we actually worship. And I also like the sense then, because now it brought me back to my deeply religious childhood, which I abandoned when I was at Fordham, by the way, as a college student. She brought me back to that sense of childhood where the mystical and the magical were still alive. That was the other thing about Dorothy Day, the most important thing I felt in her criticism of America, of Western culture, that we had created a world so rationalistic, so scientific, so practical, that there was no place left for the mystical or the magical. And that, I don't know, the world that you live in, the world I live in, there is no place for it in this society as I look about. And that made her tremendously important to me to suggest that a world in which we feel we can explain everything, a world in which there is no place for the mystical or the magical, is a very dangerous place. And of course, we see what we're doing to the planet itself, and what I feel is the sterility of this culture. So, and I said I grew up, I was a very religious young man. I wanted to be a priest when I was young till I lost my faith. Interesting to me that growing up in a Catholic household in Connecticut in a working class town, I never heard of Dorothy Day. No one ever, no nun. I was very close to a number of these nuns that I thought were wonderfully centered women and so impressive to me. Never heard her mentioned, never heard mentioned by a priest then. Fordham, only at the end did one Jesuit priest mention Dorothy Day in Catholic work. And here I am, a kid living in the Bronx in the 1970s, and I don't even know who she is. I think this is very interesting and very telling and very damning in many ways. So this was another reason to want to write this book in a way. I think people who were close to Dorothy and are close to the Catholic worker and really know religious history assume she occupies a larger place in the American mind, and she doesn't. I think she needs to be. I think she's speaking to us in ways that are profound and deeply important. But I think as a society, we have relegated her quite to the margins. I mean, you think that when she died in 1980, the front page of the Times and papers all across the country printed her obituary. And now, how many people know her? I think rather few in some ways. So that made me feel also that another book, humbly, could be presented that might be a biography read by a great range of people. So let me just jump to that last point about responses to the book, which I find so interesting. Okay, every writer wants everybody to love the book, right? And they want wonderful reviews, and they want good, and they want positive reactions. Okay, so I certainly did get some of that. I have to admit, when Bly spoke to me about this project, I didn't think we were really going to find a trade publisher in New York City who would want to publish it. Because I do, subjective view, but I do think there's an anti-Catholic bias in publishing. I do think there's not a tremendous interest in religious history anymore in mainstream publishing. Mercifully, I was wrong and she was right, and there were 3 publishers who wanted to publish the book. But what I found so interesting, though, were different responses I received from people who did know Dorothy, and they covered quite a range that was utterly plausible to me, given the place those people were coming from. But it goes back to that whole idea of what is a biography? Is it a portrait created by a particular writer or set of writers that gives their view, which necessarily includes some educated, informed inference as well, but is subjective in some ways, or is it a completely objective documentary account in some ways? So just to mention a couple things. So, there's still some people, I think, who want to see Dorothy, who only want saints to be, they were little girls who went to novenas all the time, and they lived lives of impeccable goodness when they were young. And I can't imagine anything less interesting myself. But then there also are those who want to see her story as one in which someone led a rather roustabout, lost life early on, so we know about Greenwich Village and her sexual indulgences and so on, and her ribaldry and so on and so forth, and then converted and became this person of great sanctity and clarity. And so I did get some responses. Why did you have to dwell so much on her early life and her involvements with men and the time in which she was lost and so on? Well, in truth, might as well be truthful here. I think Dorothy was much more out there than like the book even suggests in many ways. And that which makes, of course, her path, her slow, inquiring path to finding God and coming back to the church, all the more interesting to me, in many ways. But I don't think, if somebody who can understand Dorothy now, if one isn't open to the magical and the mystical and the idea that there might be something beyond us that is a source of our humanity and morality, somebody isn't that frame of mind now, that person would never understand the later Dorothy. And I likewise think that if somebody didn't understand sexual abandon and unconventional ways of living and free thinking, representing the early part of her life, they would not understand her then, and there's no point in even trying to pretend. But I do think there's a connection, and there is a totality to this. Do we believe St. Augustine had one involvement with that mistress and then came to God later and didn't? No, I don't believe that at all. I think I think the stories of people who are lost, if one wants to see it that way, or just following radically other paths they decide that don't lead to what they really want, are much more interesting stories and much more pertinent to us. One or two quick other things, then we can go to questions. So for instance, I also had a fair question. Somebody wanted to ask, why did you have to bring up the gay and lesbian part of the Catholic Worker so much? This, I feel, was a very relevant part of the story, actually. I mean, all right, why did I hate the New Yorker review of this book so much? Because that woman said she didn't learn one single thing that she didn't know before about Dorothy Day, and it had all been covered elsewhere. Well, that hadn't been covered elsewhere. I certainly didn't know when I started out researching the Catholic Worker how many gay men and lesbians devoted so much of their lives to this great cause. And it's back to paradoxes and complications. And what does Dorothy feel about that? Well, that's discussed in the book. And I think it's tremendously interesting, the ambiguities of that situation. But I certainly felt that had to be part of the story, and that was lacking from earlier stories that way. Okay, that's enough for me. I think we have questions. We must have questions by this time, Mary or Jane.
Jane, do you want to ask some of the questions that came up in the chat, or if anyone wants to put their questions or comments in the chat, and then they can chime in and ask them.
Okay, so my friend Alex typed his question in straight up right as we started. He's been dying to know, what is the source of the parenthetical statement on page 123, which states, twice since Tamar's birth, Dorothy had thought she might be pregnant again.
Right. As I was saying at the beginning, the interesting issues of writing a book about somebody that people still living knew, that a biographer could talk to, is that many people, and I met so many generous, forthcoming, informative people who are willing to go on record or be quoted or be noted in the footnotes. But then there are also others who bring up matters and definitely don't want to. There are at least 3 or 4 items in the book that are not sourced to a particular person. And then when you're in that situation, somebody's told you something, you have to you, the biographer, have to evaluate, do I put this in as a fact? Do I believe it's a fact? Does it how do I handle this? Do I leave it out or not? So that is not sourced. I'm determined to respect the wishes or privacy of anybody who told me anything that they knew or believed that they knew. So this is not something I know for a fact. This is something that fits with my view of Dorothy from many sources of her life in the late 1920s. This goes back to the responses in a way, because there are many people who insist that whatever went on with her, and there was a lot that went on with her before her conversion in the mid 1920s, that from that point on, though, she was celibate. And I don't believe that, and celibate when she had her child. And I do not believe that at all. So this sort of fit with my sense of that, but indeed, it's not sourced, because the person who indicated that Dorothy said this to him or her did not want to be quoted. In the same way that people who knew, I mean, now everyone knows about the abortion. That wasn't known, or and the circumstance of the abortion, that wasn't known till, she spoke to one person who spoke to another, and then it becomes a published matter after her death in a way. So the biographer is forced to evaluate things that are said to him. As I said, some people were incredibly generous. I mean, I had interviews at Mary House that went on for 4 or 5 hours with certain people, and it's a matter of assimilating all of this and trying to put it into what you believe is a fair portrait. That's the best I can say to that. Other questions?
Alex, does that take care of that for you?
Well, it was such a specific statement. I would have thought that there'd be at least a statement of support for it. I think even if you had said that this is what you heard from some source, that you were not allowed to specifically quote, that would have at least given some sense as to where it came from. Otherwise, it's just totally unsupported. And maybe a lawyer look for, when you hear a specific statement, I'm looking for what's behind it.
Right. So it would have been better to have put a footnote at the end saying, spoken to the author by an unnamed person. I mean,
that would have been something. At least I knew there was a source. That's it.
Right.
Thanks,
Otherwise,
Alex.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
There are 3 or 4 other things like that are mentioned in there, and they're often parenthetical, that I believe to be true, but the people who tell me this don't want to be sourced.
John, there's a question from Don. Amongst the people that you interviewed, did you interview Tom Cornell of Peter Morin Farm?
Oh, yes. I went up there and stayed with them for a bit, and Tom and Monica were wonderful in sharing their memories. And I also wanted the experience of what it'd be like staying at the farm, meeting at the time, I think there were about a dozen men staying there, and their son was working the farmland for food to bring downtown. And yeah, Tom Cornell was absolutely wonderful and very interesting in many ways.
Great. And Kristen asks if you can comment a little bit more on her commitment to racial justice.
Right. Well, good. I'm glad somebody brought that up, because certainly we know in recent years there has been criticism directed at the Catholic worker as not having paid sufficient attention to that issue, not having been as welcoming as it might have to communities of color. And those are all, first of all, they're all fair statements. All largely white organizations could be charged with the same matter, how much outreach was done. But one thing I hope the book did point out was the many ways in which this was a very great concern with her. I mean, from the earliest issues of the Catholic worker in the 1930s, where she's sending a reporter up to do an expose about conditions at Harlem Hospital, through asking speakers to come to the Friday night sessions, or early writers like Robert Steed to write about the Emmett Till case in the 50s, about discrimination, the violence in the South. This comes up in the Catholic worker a great deal. So I think, while it's true, her largest concerns were about poverty and suffering, and war and the ravages of capitalism. America's heinous record on civil rights and violence toward people of color was a concern for her early on. And I didn't know that at all. And it was reading every issue of the Catholic Worker from 1933 to 1980 that was revelatory for me. Read every issue, and it's not just a couple articles scattered about that deal with race in America. Not to mention that she went down and joined in some picketing in the South and so on. So I think those criticisms, have to be weighed against evidence that suggests it was an issue that did matter to her. What else?
I'm just noticing that one of our guests tonight is Martha Hennessy. Am I correct in assuming that's Dorothy's granddaughter? And I'm not sure if she's still on, if she would like to jump in or say anything.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to this business about her sexuality. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't know why people think that she was so sexually active. From my understanding, there were 3 men in her life. Someone she very deeply fell in love with early on and had the abortion with, or he insisted on the abortion. And then she married someone who she didn't care about on the rebound. And then when she left him, she further pursued her first love. And that, of course, did not work out. The only other love she had was Foster. And, to say that she was, being abstinent, she loved Foster. She didn't want to lose him. She sacrificed that part of her life to start the movement. And I would just like people to be clear about that.
First, I wanted to say that Martha Hennessy was a very generous interviewee, and I very much appreciated her early interest in the book. We disagree on this point, though, that Dorothy was only involved with 3 men. I think that when she says, I can't remember whether it's in a diary or letters later about the wanting to stay out of New York when she was in California, and then she went to Mexico City because New York City was an occasion for sin for
She was
her,
talking about Foster.
possibly. But I think there's enough other evidence. I mean, Malcolm Cowley, a good friend of hers, numerous people in the village. My portrait of Dorothy is of a woman of great, with a great sense of exploration and a great physical vigor and a very healthy libido when she was very young. And I don't believe that Lionel Moise, the terrible, charismatic journalist who impregnated her and was such an abusive person, I don't believe for a minute he was the first person that she was involved with. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise, but I don't think that takes, in other words, we could all be questioned as to why do you want to see Dorothy that way? You could say to me, why do you want to see Dorothy as this more roustabout figure? Or I could say, why do you want to see her as only having been involved with 3 men? Does it add, in my view of her, your view of her, does it matter? Does it add to her in any way? I'm just obviously convinced in the portrait that I wrote that this more complicated, unconventional, magnificently rebellious person in her youth is the real Dorothy. And to me, it's that incredible rebelliousness that leads the way to this incredibly rebellious figure later who questions American society and Americans' faithlessness. And I think, to me, they are 2 sides of the same coin. The Dorothy who did not want to follow anybody's rules, least of all her family's rules, least of all society's notions of how you should be as a young girl. The other side of that coin is the woman who is saying, none of us have a deep enough faith. None of us understand what God is all about, really, who is as unconventional and rebellious in the beauty of her faith as she was going down that other path. To me, that's the Dorothy I feel I came to know. Other questions, Jane?
Thank you so much, Martha. John, another question, and I think I've heard people talking about this in the while since we've been waiting for this. Do you think that Dorothy would want to be a saint? And if she's declared a saint, do you think that we'll lose this picture of her humanity or her caring for the poor? Will we make her something she wasn't?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes. So from my point of view, initially when I started my research, I thought the biographer should have no views on this whatsoever, no opinions on the sainthood matter, because that would end up with special pleading or would in some way skew the portrait I was attempting to create. Then in the middle of the research and reading all these letters and so on and so forth, I came to feel, well, if anybody's going to be a saint, this woman should be declared a saint, and that would be a good thing, especially as I read more about the thinking in Rome about making Pope Pius XII a saint. I mean, from my point of view, if Pope Pius XII is going to be a saint, good Lord, then Dorothy should be a saint. I mean, Pope Pius, this is a topic I shouldn't it gets me too exercised, but I mean, he sends Hitler a robust birthday greeting in April 1939, well after Kristallnacht. You don't send a minion of Satan a birthday greeting. That's not a saint, especially and supporting Franco for that matter, which was a particular bête noire of Dorothy's, something else I loved researching, her views about the Spanish Civil War and where she stood on neutrality in that conflict and where the Catholic Church stood. Now, I ended by thinking, though, of late, that especially after the Cardinal McCarrick business, I ended up thinking the church, in my view, the church should pause on considering anyone as venerable or saintly until the church has recovered sufficiently its moral authority after the pedophile scandal. So I feel trepidation about her being named a saint. I'm skeptical about the whole business in some ways. I mean, I'm skeptical about the archdiocese wanting to bring her from that beautiful, humble grave in Staten Island Cemetery up to the crypt in the cathedral. That she would not have liked, and I applaud the family for blocking that. But yes, I do worry. I do worry about the church as an institution we're certainly on a real run of saints lately, aren't we? Every pope is going to be named a saint. I feel she would have had issues with this. But again, we go back to Dorothy and the point, would she have criticized the church about this? No, because for her, that obedience, which liberal secular people find so hard to believe, well, how could such a smart woman be so obedient to this institution, was almost a spiritual exercise and another example of diminishing the ego and accepting the authority of something larger than oneself. So yeah, I'm very skeptical about the sainthood push, which is something that's occupied enormous time and loving labor and energy on the part of so many people. But I'm skeptical.
I think I have taken care of all the, one more question. Surely, wouldn't it be a value of the church to declare Dorothy a saint? Well,
yeah, it would be of value to the church to do that, as it was to declare Oscar Romero saint. That's a fine thing. I'm just not happy with the list of saints that we have and Dorothy being added to that number. On the other hand, of course, we have to remember she wrote that book about the little flower. She herself had particular saints that were very meaningful to her. So if she's declared a saint, yes, there will be some positive dimensions to that. But I've come back to a faith because of her, but I haven't come back, and I would never have an uncritical perspective on the institution of the church and its ways. Let's put it that way.
Two more questions just came in, John. One from Joan says, I'm curious about what Dorothy wrote about the final days at Tivoli. It sounded so out of control. What were her observations?
Yeah, she knew.
I'll let you do that, and then I'll tell you the next question.
Tivoli, if anybody's not familiar, was the place upstate. really, the person we should be talking about here is Peter Morin. I mean, and if we're talking about saints, let's forget Pius XII. Let's find out about Peter Morin. There's a saint. But he, her great inspiration, the person she said, this vagabond French intellectual, the person she said, without whom there would be no Catholic worker. He wanted her to not only have Catholic worker houses of hospitality in the city, but he wanted places outside the city, agronomic universities, as he called them, where people could go to be refreshed, and a green revolution and a concern for our environmental well-being. These were issues he talked about early on, which she felt as well. However, they never worked. They never worked. I mean, Dorothy was a libertarian. She wasn't. She never joined the Socialist Party. That's an error. She certainly never joined the Communist Party. That's sheer stupidity. The people who say she was a communist. She was a libertarian, and she did not, and a personalist. And she did not believe in directing people, even the people who lived in the houses, who would have driven every one of us mad to be around these people who were so difficult in the houses of hospitality. They were to be regarded, in Peter Morin's view and in her view, as guests, and therefore one shouldn't bully them, one demand things from them, one shouldn't proselytize from them. Up at Tivoli, upstate New York, things certainly got out of hand. It's the 1970s, and every hippie in the Northeast has heard there's this place you can go hang out, and there's this old lady there who's very religious, but she won't really bother you if you and your 6 friends decide to have fun in the bedroom upstairs and drink yourselves into a stupor and do as much pot as you want, and so on and so forth. So while there are many aspects to it that were positive, it did run out of control, and she knew it at a certain point, and so they had to get rid of it in a way. But there's another aspect of Dorothy, the paradox of Dorothy. So many priests and nuns came to visit the houses of hospitality, for instance, or these farms, and said, does it have to be? Couldn't you have some rules? Couldn't you make people do some things so that this place, help them? They're going to stay overnight, make them clean, wash a dish, something. But they're called houses of hospitality. I believe that was Peter Morin's phrase, for a reason. And if you bring someone into your home, a guest of your hospitality, you're not going to say, but by the way, you better sweep the floor or help me with the dishes later. So how is that going to work upstate either? So yeah, it would have been pretty difficult. These people, she often said, the thing about the homeless you have to remember, and she didn't mean this in a mean-spirited way, you have to remember they don't smell good, they tend to steal, and they're not grateful. And too bad if you have a problem with any of that, because of course she believed more than any of us ever do that what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, as Jesus said, and that we should find Jesus in all of these people, however difficult they are. So her tolerance for putting up with all this was pretty great. But that's another aspect of her that is maybe an example to us, even if we don't follow it. One other point to make about this, though, by the 50s, when she would go on her massive lecture tours, the lecture circuit, she was often, by then the audiences were a little less polite and forbearing, and she would often get a lot of criticism by the 50s of, what do you expect us all? You think poverty is somehow holier than a middle-class life? You think there's something holy about cockroaches and dirt and rats, lady? And what do you expect from us? And she was very careful to say constantly, and I thought this was wonderful, everyone must find his or her own level of commitment to the cross. No, I don't expect you to live the way I do at all. I just expect you to find your own level of commitment. And this is what I think was so profound. What she asked of all of us, and which we fail to do constantly, is to push ourselves to that level of commitment to what the cross, to what the Sermon of the Mount really means to us. There are times when I think only she and Peter Morin actually believed the Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, what was the other question?
The other question was, what lessons, if any, do you draw from the enduring tensions that existed between Dorothy's role and commitment as a parent, as a mother, and as her role and commitment to public life?
Right. This was another response to the book. Some people insisting, no, she was not as bad a mother as you portray her. She loved Tom. She loved her daughter. Their daughter loved her, etc. I don't dispute that, the love, but all right, how many of us would want to be the child of, name any saint you want, Saint Jerome, Saint Augustine, name any saint you want. Parenthood and sainthood to that level of commitment to the cross do not work smoothly at all. So some people said the book criticized her as a mother. I don't feel that I criticized her as a mother. We said, this is how it is. And boy, was it difficult for her daughter and the family, given the fact that she thought they should also potentially embrace voluntary poverty and share her spiritual values and the piety that later became too extraordinary in some ways for her daughter. So I don't dispute there is love, but I certainly don't believe the book was saying she should have been a better mother. That's to me is ridiculous, right? As saying, yeah, Saint Jerome should have been more friendly to people, or Saint Augustine shouldn't have been quite so tough as he was. I mean, this goes with what they are exploring, what they are committing themselves to. So yes, would one want to parent like that? No, but then we're talking about a different thing.
And then maybe this is a decent place to kind of come to a close. Can you comment more on the idea of the unworthy poor and her emphasis on welcoming all?
Sure. George Bernard Shaw, in one of his plays, has a character use the phrase about the deserving poor. I think this is Pygmalion, the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And these are notions that are also very American, right? This is a country that has made a central foundational myth about the idea of competition and rugged individualism and pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps and evaluating one's worth based on how much money one has and so on and so forth. The idea that there are undeserving poor people, there are lazy poor people, there are poor people we shouldn't help. This was anathema to Dorothy, who said, it's not our place. There's no such thing as the undeserving poor. There's no such thing as that we should be giving regardless. I was walking on the street one day with behind some people, and someone gave some money to an obviously distressed person there, and the person walking with that woman said, he's just going to use it on drugs or drink. And then I heard the one say, yes, but even alcoholics or drug addicts have to buy food sometimes. So, the idea that how often do we look at these people on the street? The homeless are still with us, and evaluate them by our middle class standards of how they should be acting. She asked us to think. I mean, who really believes that what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, that is actually God there before us? How many people actually believe that? That she was pressing us to think more about it, what became tremendously meaningful to me. Okay, but now to digress back to the sainthood thing, I'll admit I was shocked beyond belief when I just read that this process and sending all the documents to Rome and all that's involved in it had cost $1 million. Okay, I knew it's expensive. I mean, everybody should read Making Saints by Kenneth Woodward. Great book on the process that heads to sainthood. It's a really wonderful book. But the idea that $1 million was spent to make her a saint, okay, that's when I really thought, what would that $1 million have done to some people? We're not going to pretend homelessness still doesn't exist in New York City, are we? What could that $1 million have done? That's where I think she would have said, wait a minute, what is this all about? And who was really listening to me in what I'm talking about, and who was listening to the Sermon on the Mount? If we're spending $1 million to accredit her with this title. Yeah, so I guess my issues are growing with that matter.
I think we may have come to a natural end to the questions. I don't know if John or Mary, you have anything to kind of tie all of this in a bow.
Well, if anyone has any more comments, although I would mention to John, remember the story of the woman who broke over the head of Jesus, that expensive bottle of ointment, spice, and, they were criticized where that money could have been spent on the poor. So I think this is a 2,000-year-old question, where we spend our money and what, what benefit it would be for all of us, and where the best use of our money would be. So I want to thank everyone for coming. I know we have people from all over the country, and so I'm so happy that John was able to talk to us. And if you haven't read the book, sometimes it's nice to hear about the book first and then read it yourself and come to your own conclusions. And certainly I learned a lot about Dorothy, and I really enjoyed it, and a lot of food for thought. And so you might want to gather individually and discuss it further. And I would please invite any of you who are on this, if you're interested in joining our monthly book club. I see Carlin and Kristen next to me. They're faithful members. And we'd love to have you. Just email me and I'll send you the information about our books. We have a whole variety of books, and we meet via Zoom the second Monday of every month. So Father Kelly, maybe you could close us in a quick prayer. And
Could I make one comment before Father Kelly does that? If anyone wishes to talk about anything further, I'm available at jflokery@gmail.com, and of course, love to have any conversation with anybody about this remarkable woman and the issues that she brings up. Thank you.
so, yes, and if there are any further comments, we can check. Let me see the chat. And so, Father Kelly, if you would want to end us in prayer and give us some final inspiration that we've all had from Dorothy.
I don't think I could add to what John and everyone's questions. I think it's been thought-provoking and spiritually enriching for us to enter into the life of a New Yorker, and someone who in many ways derived her strength from the streets of New York, where we are right now. So we remember that in the early church, sainthood was pretty much by popular acclaim. So I think we can say in many ways that the church in New York has already recognized Dorothy as someone raised up and in the beatific vision. So we ask her to be with us this evening and to pray that we'll learn to love that radical vision of the Sermon on the Mount, where we actually do see Christ in the dispossessed, the poor, the forgotten, the marginalized, all those people we tend to want to put to the side, that we recognize, as our good Pope Francis these days is saying, the margins need to become the center. And we trust in God, and we give thanks to God for bringing us together this evening, for John's scholarship, for the insights of so many here, and above all, for the gift and the grace of Dorothy's life, which continues to bear fruit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Mary.
Mary.
Thank
Have a
you,
good night.
John.
John, thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
Good. It was good. Fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it was, was it Martha Hennessy?